In chapter 1, we covered the basis of CSS transitions. Now let's use what we learned to create something together. So in this tutorial we will be creating a tooltip. Here is a preview of the final result, and as you can see there is a bold call to action button, and when you go over the button we fire a tooltip. So there are two main animations. First of all, we switch the text and we replace it with an icon, and secondly we fire the tooltip. And the saddle animations are achieved in both cases using CSS transitions. Okay, so let's create this tooltip together. So first of all, I'm creating a wrap element. So I'm starting with a section, and inside the section I'm creating another div element whose purpose is going to be to move everything to the center of the canvas. So it's not really a necessary step, but just for moving everything to the center. Okay, now I'm creating an anchor tag, which is going to be our button. You can use a button element as well. And okay, now, and I'm giving it a class, just to trigger class. Okay, perfect. Now if we look back at the button, so we can notice there are two main blocks which are moving inside the button. So the text is replaced by the icon. So I think it's easier if we create two additional elements, one for the text and the other one for the icon. So I'm using an M tag for the text, and I'm creating an I tag for the icon. So the I tag is going to be empty because I'm adding the icon as a background image, but maybe it's better if we use an aria hidden value true. Basically we are saying we want this element to be rendered by the browser, but at the same time we don't want to affect people. We are using assistive technologies to, you know, serve our content. Okay, so here we are. And one more thing, for this animation to work, and I'm specifically talking about the text and the icon. When the text moves up, it's actually going to be here. So we need a wrap to have an overflow hidden, so that everything which is outside this wrap, which has the same size of the button, is not going to be visible. So I'm creating one last element, another inline element, and I'm moving everything inside this element here. Right, perfect. So this is our structure. We can move to the CSS. Okay, so the starting point of the CSS is just some really basic style. I'm just changing the boxing model, changing the box sizing property to border box, and some other really basic style. Now, since we are creating everything from scratch, I want to use a color palette. The easiest way to use a color palette is maybe just, you know, check for one application which is going to provide you color palettes, and I'm using coolors.com, which is really really simple to use. And okay, we can use this one. So first of all, I'm taking this color and I'm using it as the background color. Right, okay, so let's move here. So as you can see, here is our button. And before we were saying that the purpose of the section is to, and the element, the div with the center class, is to move everything to the center of the canvas. So let's see how. First of all, I want to give to the section the same size of the body. And I'm applying a 100% width, a 100% height. Now let's check if it's actually covering. And you can see that is not. It's actually taking the space occupied by the children. So a way to go around this is to replace 100% with 100 VH, which stands for viewport height. Okay, and now we are covering the entire sides. And now if we give it a display table, we can actually use the center class and give it a display table cell, right? And at this point, we can use the vertical align middle to move everything in the center vertically, and the text align center to align everything horizontally. So this is a nice, nice trick. Now, this is done. Let's add some style to the button. So the trigger, we want to give it a background color. So one more time, we move in here, and I'm going to take this bright color here. Okay. We are going to give it a display in line block so that we can give it some values for the sides. Maybe a width of 200 pixels, a height of, let's see, around 60 pixels. Now a trick to add some round angles, some round corners, is just to apply a border radius with a really high value, like that. And if we were to style a little bit more the button, we can just give it a box shadow with 0 on the x-axis and maybe 2 pixels on the y, and I don't know, 10 pixels for the blurriness, RGBA with the black color, and a 0.7 because the background is quite dark. Okay, this one is not really visible. Let's give it an inset box shadow as well with the 0, 1 pixel, and 0 for blur. This is going to create just a crisp line on top, and this time the RGBA value is going to be white with a 0.4 for the opacity. Right, so let's reduce a bit the opacity, and as you can see, with just a couple of box shadows, now we have some depth and it's looking nicer. Right, now inside the trigger we have the span element, and we were saying before the purpose of the span element is just to have an overflow hidden so that anything which is moving outside of the button is going to be not visible. So, and for this to work, we have to make sure that the span element has the same size of the button, but at the same time we want the text block and the icon block to have the same size of the button. So what I'm doing here is I'm taking the span, the M and the I tag, and I'm giving to all of them a position absolute with a width of 100%, a height of 100%, and a left value of 0. And now obviously I need to give to the parent a position relative, so the position of the span M and I is related to the position of the trigger. So here we go. So all these elements have actually the same size of the button. You can see if I give a green background to all of them, they're actually taking the same space of the button here. Now what I need to do, so first of all, I want to give some style to the M element, just some really basic style. We can give it to the trigger. In general, we can give it a white color for the text. To the M element, we can move it more in the center with the line height, which is the same height of the button, equal to the height of the button. Sorry. Here we go. Now it's in the center. Now the M element needs a top value which is 0, while the I tag, first of all we give it a background which is the icon. So I have inside my image folder an icon-download.svg image which I'm using as a background image. So icon-download.svg, and we place it right in the center of the button. There we go. But then I'm moving this icon outside by giving a top value of 100%. So it's actually in here. Now it's not visible because, as we said before, we're applying an overflow hidden to the span element. So it's right here. Okay, now, so the first animation, when we go hover the trigger, we want the top of the text to change from 0 to minus 100%. And at the same time, we want the top of the I tag to change from 100% to 0. So if we go hover the button, as you can see, we switch from the text to the icon, as we should expect, as we said in chapter 1. By default, CSS changes happen instantaneously. So a way to spread this change over some time is just to use a transition. So what I'm doing here, I'm taking the M and the I tag, and I'm saying apply a transition to the top value of 0.3 seconds. Now it's really subtle. There is an animation. You can actually see the text moving up and the icon sliding in from the bottom. And just to show you something, so this way we can understand better, the entire animation. If I remove the overflow hidden property, you can see the icon is right here at the bottom. So when I go hover the button, we push the text up, the text block up, and at the same time we push up the icon. So the trick is achieved by a simple transition and an overflow property. Now we have the first part of the animation covered. So let's move forward. We need a tooltip. Now inside the HTML document, we didn't create any structure for the tooltip because we can use, for the simple animation, we can just use a pseudo element. So we will create a tooltip by adding a pseudo element to the trigger element, so to the main button. So first of all, we want to create the tooltip with the content, which in this case can be something like file size 50 megabyte. All right. Now, first of all, we need to move this up and outside the button. So I'm giving it position absolute and a size. We're going to give it background as well. And one more time, we're taking. Okay, maybe this one can work. Color from our color palette, and we are just giving a little bit of border radius just because it looks nicer this way. Now to move it out from the button, we need to give it a bottom value which has to be higher than the height of the button, obviously. So it's going to be, I don't know, 90 pixels, and we can give it a line height equal to the height so that the text is in the center. And finally, we can give it a left value, and we can use a calc function to mix two units and give it a left value which is 50% minus half the width of the element, so minus 70 pixels. There it is. Now, for the small triangle, you can see here there is a small triangle at the bottom. We can actually use another pseudo element. We can use an after element. So let's create the triangle, always in CSS. Now, first of all, I need to add to the triangle some content, even though it's empty, just to make it visible. And now I want to apply position absolute and which is something I already used for the before pseudo elements. So when I have two elements with the same some common properties, it is a good habit to group these properties. So trigger before and trigger after, so they both have a position absolute. So here we go, we can remove this one. This can be really handy later if you want to apply something to both the triangle and the main body of the tooltip. Okay, now the triangle. So in order to create a triangle in CSS, we need to apply first of all a width of 0, a height of 0, and a border. Now the border has to be, let's first we can pick a size, say 10 pixel solid, and we can give for the moment, okay, let's give the same color of the tooltip for now. Just want to show you something. As you can see, what we get here is a square. The size of the square is double the size of the border, so we have a square 20 by 20 pixels. Now if we switch the color to transparent, we can actually create a rectangle just by simply border top color, giving a border top color, and obviously of the same color of the tooltip. Here we go. If we wanted to create a triangle in the opposite direction, I should have just have written something like border bottom color. So same thing for left and right, you get the point. For now I need a border top color. There we go. So once again I want to align this triangle, and I need a left value. I'm using always the calc function, which is really handy. 50% minus half the size of a square that we were saying is 20 pixels. So here it is in the center, and then we need use some math to move this up to the right below the tooltip. Here it is. Okay, so this is our tooltip. Now by default we want both the before and after elements to not be visible. So one way to do so is by the simplest way maybe is by adding a display block, a display none, sorry. So by default we're saying you're not visible, you have display none, and then when we go hover the trigger, we want both the before and after element pseudo elements to be visible, so we give them a display of block. Now is this going to work? Yeah, obviously it does work, but it's an immediate effect. So if you want to go for an immediate effect, this is a way to achieve this result. But we want to apply transition, and unfortunately you cannot apply transition to the display property. Therefore we have to change our strategy. I'm removing the display and I'm using the opacity instead. So opacity 0 to opacity 1. Alright, and I'm already applying a transition. So one more time to apply transition, you write transition, and then you recall the property to which you want to apply transition, and finally the duration of the transition. So we give it the same duration of the other animation, the animation of the text. Right. So remember, if you want to support older browsers, you have to use vendor prefixes, but for this tutorial I'm just sticking with the unprefixed property. Okay. So let's see. Now as you can see, there is a nice fade in effect when I move in, and fade in, fade out effect when I move out of the button. Anyway, however, we have a problem here. When we play with the opacity, we are actually, the element is not visible, but it's still there. I mean, I can still interact with the element on mouse over. So I need to combine the opacity with another property for this to work. And I will be using the visibility. So when you use the visibility, and you add, for example, a visibility hidden, the element is still part of the flow, even though in this case it's not, because we have it in absolute position, so it's no longer in the flow. It's no longer affecting the elements around it. So, but at the same time, we're saying there is no way to interact with this element. Now, as you can see, I cannot interact with it. So, combined with the opacity, it's a nice trick to create a tooltip effect. So opacity and visibility, obviously. So opacity 1, and at the same time I'm giving it a visibility visible. Now the nice thing is that the good news is that visibility support the transition. So what I'm doing here, I'm adding the visibility as well here with the same duration. Now if we check, we have a nice fade effect. If I go here, there is no way to interact with the content anymore, and everything is working just fine. So one last little detail could be that we, when there is a hover on the before element and the after, we change the bottom value as well, of let's say around 10 pixels. So this is going to be 80 pixels, and this is going to be a bottom value of 60 pixels. So instead of writing here comma and then top and always 0.3 seconds, we can even at this point replace this with the old value. So what we have here now is here the entire effect working. So there is nothing more to add for this tutorial. You can play around with it and try to change some of the effects if you want. And one last note is that, as you can see, we did a lot of transitions to the same button, maybe unnecessary some of them. The purpose was to understand the way transitions work. In most cases, in almost every case, a transition is just a subtle effect. It's not something heavy, let's say. And it's a good thing, because you're actually improving the user experience of your users. But at the same time, if a transition is not supported by browser, the experience is not really broken. It's just different, it's instantaneous, but still the user has access to the content and everything is working just fine. So think of transitions as a way to improve user experience through subtle animations.